Welcome to Good God, conversations that matter about faith and public life. I'm your host, George Mason, and I'm so pleased to welcome to this conversation Eric Cedillo, who is an attorney here in Dallas and actually working beyond Dallas because he is legal counsel to LULAC, the League of
United Latin American Citizens.
League of United Latin American Citizens. Terrific. And Eric and I work together in the community, Faith Commons and Eric, and a group that we've helped to organize with the United Way that focuses on voting registration, voting access, and those sorts of things. We've called it Dallas Votes.
Right.
And Eric, let's just start there, if we may.
Absolutely.
I think you have been a past president of a group called March to the Polls, seeking to get people out to the polls, young people in particular, but anyone.
Right.
And so tell us a little bit about March to the Polls and what has been your interest in voting access.
Absolutely. March to the Polls, basically created by myself and Richard Marcus,
Yes.
individual who unfortunately passed away very recently. Just a wonderful man, wonderful human being. I was actually with LULAC and working with the League of Women Voters a few years back, probably about 15 years or so ago, where we would go into the schools and do registrations for high school seniors. So that was kind of our initial entry in. And then with March to the Polls, once we got that going after about 2017-18, we started actually taking over those responsibilities for LULAC and the League of Women Voters and became more ensconced and specifically in DISD. We were developed a very good relationship with the superintendent and others to be able to go in there and actually do some registrations with them. And you know, presently we're the sole contractee for going into the schools in DISD and a few other ISDs locally to register high school students in each of the 2 semesters. In addition to that, we've created what's called the Student Voter Empowerment Clubs that we have in many of our ISDs, and specifically in DISD. I believe we have over 30 now. And those are clubs that we kind of have the opportunity to allow students to civically engage in however they kind of want to learn that context.
Right.
We take them down to Austin, down to see the legislature and see how the sausage is made.
Yes.
And then just do a number of other things, field trips and doing things. They'll put together projects that we support. We've actually done some marching to the polls, taking students down at Woodrow and walking or marching down to go vote. So incredible stuff that we're doing. In addition to that, we have another component to March to the Polls, which is sponsored by March to the Polls, called the Latino Voter Empowerment Coalition. And that's just a group that kind of goes out into, initially we were going door knocking, telling people about the importance of voting, specifically in those Latino areas where there just isn't a high proportionate number of individuals voting. So we wanted to kind of engage in that.
Say more about that. Why would you say that's true?
Well, I think there's a variety of reasons why Latinos don't vote. And to be really honest with you, just kind of from my perspective and looking at that, I think the Latino experience here in the United States has been one of, we kind of get by, treated differently in a lot of ways, but if we can just kind of get by, don't make any trouble, culturally, that's kind of something that we do. And that's kind of passed on, I think, generationally.
I see.
That's the reason for the creation of the LVEC clubs. We were hoping, or the LVEC engagement, we wanted to engage the older folks, grandparents, parents, about the importance of it, because there's always been that disconnect, I think, in many of our, believe it or not, George, there is, at least in my opinion, almost 2 different worlds that we live in. Here in Dallas, we get our news differently if you're listening to it in Spanish or radio. There's an import on certain areas of the news that people who primarily speak Spanish don't always get from what the English reporters are doing. So it is it's a difference that kind of leaves people in just kind of a different world. there's a lot of politicians who don't go door knocking because of that lack of propensity, and that's kind of the impetus behind getting engagement. You've got individuals who are running for elected office doing the engagement, and they're going to do it in those areas where there's high propensity voters.
Of course.
And those are not, unfortunately, those Latino areas. So you'll go into some Latino neighborhoods and they've never had anybody come door knock and say, hey, there's an election coming up. So that's kind of something that is, there's just because they don't vote, they aren't pushed to vote. And
so it's a catch-22.
Exactly. That circular problem of not getting out there.
And yet, voting is the most foundational activity of democracy, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And when people are voting, they are taking ownership of their citizenship.
Absolutely.
And now, having said that, we're talking about people who are actually citizens, who are voting. There has been accusations that non-citizens vote, and you and I know that we have the statistics, and we know that that's not true.
Right.
In fact, I was just actually looking this morning, Eric, and found that since 2005, there have only been 133 prosecutions of voter fraud, 133, and most of those have been dismissed.
Right.
So we're talking about millions and millions of votes.
Right.
Why do you think there is such an effort now to make it more difficult to register to vote and to vote in elections?
Well, really honestly, I believe that there is a movement to maintain the status quo. There's individuals who certain individuals, of course, you break it down into parties, and the Republican Party that want to maintain what's happening, what's going on. If you change, access, if you allow for perhaps even younger people, may not even be so much you're Hispanic or Latino or African American, it is younger people who have a tendency to vote in higher numbers in the Democratic Party. You don't want that to happen. So how do we disenfranchise? How do we disengage those individuals? Well, let's make it tougher. Let's create obstacles that are problematic. As you know, in 2012, when voter identification came out, over the last few years, people have said, okay, voter identification, that's understandable. At the time, everybody knew it was going to be incredibly disenfranchising, to the tune of about 250,000 Latinos just in the state of Texas. We knew it was going to happen. We had an incredible federal judge at the time who saw it and did her best to stop it. Unfortunately, with what she came out in terms of her orders, allowed for them to engage in, we'll make some concessions and we'll allow this to happen, but the disengagement, the disenfranchisement became a reality.
Yes.
Voter identification for us, of course we have a driver's license, of course we have identification. Young people don't.
Yes.
18 to 21-year-olds don't necessarily have that in the numbers that would allow them to easily engage, easily register, and then easily vote. So we're seeing it more and more as I believe we had talked about the SAVE Act at the federal level.
Yes, let's talk about the SAVE
Absolutely.
Act. This is something being proposed in Congress to increase the requirements of voter identification.
Right, voter registration.
Yep.
And that is the thing. As we all know, different states have different requirements for registering to vote. In some states, they make it incredibly easy. Same-day registration,
Yes.
Hey, no problem, let's register, let's go online, let's do all the things to make it simple, which it should be. This is just registration. It's not the actual act of voting. It's just the registration. In Texas, we know that we have to be registered to vote at least 30 days before an election if we're to vote in that election. So the voter ID that I had mentioned earlier back in 2012, incredibly difficult for some young people to engage. Now what the SAVE Act is requesting, and again, this is at the federal level, it's being bandied about the House and the Senate kind of as we speak, is a requirement that you actually have to physically go down into the elections department and register to vote and prove that you're a U.S. citizen. Now, believe it or not, that's not an easy feat for anyone. You know, we may have passports, we may have access to identification that allows us to easily go in, and just the act of going into the voter registration department is difficult in and of itself. But then to have a passport, which many young people do not have, and or a birth certificate, a certified birth certificate to prove citizenship, the more obstacles you have, the more difficult it becomes. In addition to that, what this would do is just do away with DVRs, people who actually go out and register people to vote, voter registration drives, which we have. It would decimate what things like March to the Polls does, which is register high school seniors. They'd have to go down and actually take documentation to go do this. And the thing which I find most insidious is the law itself it requires anyone who's changed their name because they've been married, certainly affecting women, and then others who
this is really important. This is really important.
Right.
Yes.
Not to be able to go in there if their birth certificate does not match their name on their identification, which is probably changed.
Yes.
Then that's not good enough to register. So they would need to have they need to go down and make sure that they have proper documentation to be able to get their passport or utilize a passport if they don't have one, to kind of make that happen. 55% of Americans, just across the board, usually go to the DMV and do that voter registration. Easily accessible, easily done. 55%. That would no longer be something that they could do under the SAVE Act.
This is going to shrink voting.
Absolutely.
At a time when, if we're going to promote democracy, we want to expand voting.
Absolutely.
The voice of people to say what kind of government they want to have.
Right.
And it seems to be, as I mentioned earlier, the very small percentage of voter fraud that has existed. To pass the SAVE Act is, in effect, to create a solution where there is no problem.
Right.
And when you do that, you are actually creating a problem for democracy, right? Because you're limiting people's participation.
Absolutely.
At a time when many people are discouraged about participating anyway. So the SAVE Act is alive in Congress today and is worth people's attention, and contacting your legislators, congresspersons and senators, and so please be aware of that.
Yeah.
Sponsored, I think, by one of our Texas representatives, right?
Yes.
Chip Roy. So, in any case, okay. So voting has been something that you've been passionate about. Immigration is another thing. Tell us more about your engagement with immigration.
Well, I've always been, an advocate for immigrants' rights. I think there's been an incredible, just cyclically, issue. When the Bushes were in office, it was, Latinos are the backbone of society, and we need immigration to do X, Y, Z. After 9/11, I was sitting in my office, and which was near, downtown Dallas, and we started hearing, after it happened in the weeks that followed, a number of judges, asking, hey, do we have an obligation to report these people? We find out they're not here legally. Do we have to do this? So we started kind of getting together with other attorneys and groups to let them know that was not a requirement. It's probably something they shouldn't be doing. But it was a very scary time because we had this history of, okay, immigrants are wonderful and Latinos are the backbone, and we're charging forward. It was just an incredible retraction from that, which was very scary.
Yes.
And unfortunately, I think that what came from that was an opportunity for some, and within the Republican Party, to start creating this boogeyman. We've got this boogeyman to the south that is invading our borders, and that has become kind of a rallying cry from that point forward to really treat immigrants as the other. And when you do that, we know historically that can be incredibly problematic for that group, and that's exactly what we're seeing. And today we're seeing it in what we're hearing from the federal level, what we're hearing down in Austin. It's very scary. You've got people who've been here and contributing for years and years, just raising families, creating businesses, doing all the things that that good Americans should be doing.
Right.
And now they're talking about them as being criminals and problematic and in need of getting rid of them from our country.
Well, and there's one thing to say that when someone is a criminal because they have been, convicted of some sort of
Right.
illegal activity in the country of origin
Right.
or in our own country, that's one thing. But when they're called criminals simply because they've crossed the border
Right.
without documentation
Right.
to do so, now you're extending the definition of criminality in a very broad way. But let's play devil's advocate, and I'd love to hear your comments about
Sure.
this. Obviously, we have had a massive influx of people trying to get into the country
Right.
across the southern border. And there are all sorts of reasons for that, and it's been very difficult for the U.S. to manage that movement of people. The migration from South and Central America has been massive.
Right.
For reasons of climate change and drug cartels and lack of jobs and economic opportunity and all of that, but sometimes persecution and
Right.
sometimes violence and danger as well in these places. So when people make these claims about invasion and
Right.
this sort of thing, how do you speak to them and say, wait a minute, okay, yes, they're coming, and yes, they are desperate to get to this country, and no, everyone hasn't gone through all the right procedures. How would you differentiate the arguments, and how would you speak to people about what's happening in the lives of people at the border?
What I think most people don't realize is that we've had this for years and years. It's
Yes.
been a situation where we've had mass movement and migration from
Yes.
through Mexico, which of course you're talking about the Central Americans and South Americans kind of coming through. Different, of course, countries have different movements based on what's going on in that particular country. But we've had pretty much the same numbers throughout since before Obama, or probably since Obama. As many know, he probably deported more individuals than
Yes.
than other presidents. So it's been something that's been relatively consistent in terms of that movement. It hasn't been something that has been overwhelming and okay, now we're being invaded. I know that's difficult for people to kind of fathom, and I get that. Realistically, when we have a system that allows people to come in and make asylum claims, which is our federal law,
Yes.
you reach American soil, you have a fear of persecution in your home country, you have the legal ability to make an asylum claim, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's a situation where people are entitled to that according to federal law. What we've done recently was basically shut down the border. We're not going to allow people to even make that asylum claim because they're not going to step on U.S. soil and do those things. And it is for those people that I am truly most concerned, because I've
Yes.
seen it. I've been down there. I've seen people fleeing persecution in their home countries, literally life or death, and us returning them back to death. Mm-hmm. And I mean that with all sincerity.
Yes.
Those are very realistic things that happen, and I don't think people really understand that is what's going on in some of these countries. I totally agree with you that as the United States, we have the ability to keep those people out of our country that would want to do harm, that have committed crimes in their home countries, mm-hmm. that would continue to commit crimes here. I don't think anyone is arguing that. I even, the furthest to the left progressive that you could kind of contemplate.
No, I don't know those people either.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right.
They don't really exist, but
Right.
you've got to, again, create a boogeyman that kind of puts
Right.
them all into one little, funneling of individuals and say, okay, all these people are this. My biggest concern is that when we shut down the border, and Biden, Biden did it too with Title 42. He closed down the border based on, I think, some political pressure to do that. We don't have to be that way as a country. We don't. When you say a lack of resources, that is all on Congress to be able to accommodate that. We overwhelm, and I really believe this, we overwhelm intentionally to maintain a certain amount of migration that kind of comes in, and do it in such a way that that we have everything maintaining a status quo.
Right.
We allow for laborers to come over, that we can depress the levels of and amounts that we pay them, mm-hmm. in order to make profits here in the United States. That's historically what we've done.
Right.
We don't allow Mexico, which is our biggest relationship in terms of migration or moving historically that we've ever had. We don't allow them any additional ability to allow for people to come over legally than any other country.
Yes.
And that's intentional in a lot of ways in our immigration system. But even talking to that or speaking to that, the intent of Congress and doing what it's doing, the levels haven't changed all that much.
Right.
It is just the focus on the optics of, oh my gosh, look at these caravans, look at these people. There is no doubt that there are some bad people kind of coming in, trying to enter without inspection. That's a very real possibility.
Right.
So we do need to maintain and be careful about who's coming in and doing what we're doing. I think we could easily take care of that if we wanted to.
Yes.
If we would address those issues. We overwhelm those counties, we overwhelm those border cities by not allowing enough monies to flow to take care of them. And the unfortunate thing about that is we don't have to do that. Our Congress has been, has done nothing to truly address it.
Well, let's talk about Congress, because immigration is federal responsibility.
Right.
And now we know that in Texas, because our governor has been unhappy with federal enforcement of immigration law and discipline at the border, Texas has gotten involved in that process as well and is now seeking reimbursement from the federal government for its policing of the border. But Congress is supposed to regulate immigration.
Right.
Everybody knows that we need an immigration reform law passed. No one seems to be in agreement about what it should look like.
Right.
But it is also true that regardless of Democrat or Republican Congresses, there's really been no motivation for them to achieve it, because if whatever law is passed, it's going to have to be a compromise. And that compromise is going to be bad politically for anyone who votes for it, right? Somehow immigration has always been, unfortunately, something that is a negative rather than a positive for politicians. Why do you think that is, Eric?
I think there's on both sides, both Democrat and Republican. I think a prime example is DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Incredibly popular. Young people who are brought into this country as children, as toddlers, through no fault of their own, kind of being brought over here. They're not U.S. citizens because they, of course, weren't born here. And DACA, created by Obama to allow these people to at least be able to stay through prosecutorial discretion. Basically, no permanent avenue to stay, but we're not going to deport you, and we're going to give you the ability to work here.
Right.
So these DACA recipients, I cannot tell you how incredible, if you look at them in terms of the percentages of doctors, lawyers, teachers, just across the board, doing incredible things to the tune of hundreds of thousands who've partaken of the DACA process. Very popular. Opportunities for Democrats to kind of get that piece of legislation passed. The problem with it, I think, politically, was the speed at which they would give them an opportunity to become citizens.
Yes.
The belief being on the Republican side that, hey, we're going to get a lot of primarily Latinos, primarily Hispanics who are DACA recipients, the ability to become U.S. citizens within a certain period of time. And then you're looking at a number of voters who might vote Democrat. So,
and is that actually true, do you think? I mean, it may be so, but I mean, it seems that in recent elections, Latinos have not automatically voted Democrat.
Yeah, I think the bigger question, of course, with respect to who's doing what, voting Democrat, voting Republican among Latinos, is the age group. Okay. So young people have a tendency to vote for Democrats, just the initial attraction to what Democrats kind of bring to the table. Republican Latinos certainly exist, and especially the further south you go in Texas, that's a very realistic thing. You're talking about people who've been there in those areas for perhaps hundreds of years.
Yes,
and it's just the conservative nature of the way in which they see things, maybe fiscally and otherwise, that would lend them to become Republicans. I think it's the young people equation. And the DACA recipients, by way of the law itself, these are young people. You know, you couldn't have been a certain age when you came over. You couldn't be a certain age when you applied. You had to be at a younger age. So DACA recipients are going to be younger. Realistically, if you look at it, they probably will be voting Democrat in a higher percentage. Not necessarily all of them, but at a higher percentage. And that has been the fear by Republicans to not allow it to pass, even though at certain times it had a 90% popularity rate in terms of what's there. So they're the ones that are kind of if you want to examine how these things work and flow politically, DACA recipients are the ones that you really look at and say, if they can't get something done, how in the world are we going to get the rest of this done? So there's two sides to it, but we are hopeful that at present, the way in which the current administration is talking, and this may segue into our to talk about the march, is that we might have a possibility, and it's always been my hope that Republicans would at least embrace the possibility that they've got to come back to the Latino vote at some point. We're not going anywhere in terms of percentages. They can only keep us at bay for a certain period of time, and honestly, that's what they've been doing for a number of years. So at some point, you would imagine they'd want to embrace Latinos.
Exactly.
So that's a possibility, and I'm hopeful that at the very least that may be something that might actually be done by Congress, soon. When they stop talking about, well, we're going to get rid of all the criminal immigrants, or we're going to get rid of, well, who's next? Let's at least look at the possibility of making an exception for those people who've been here for a number of years, who've been contributing and doing the right things, and for DACA recipients who have to be perfect just about in order to be able to partake.
Well, Eric, it's been curious to me because Republicans have been advocating for traditional values. The vast majority of Latinos in this country are Catholic in their religious orientation, and as such, generally speaking, the values of the Catholic Church and the Latino culture sync up fairly well with conservative evangelical Republican values also, which makes it curious to me as to why there's not a greater eagerness to embrace the Latino community from the Republican side. I can see why Democrats have typically wanted to embrace cultural differences and ethnic differences as a sign of how America is a multicultural, multi-ethnic kind of country. But from a standpoint of values and religious culture and all of that, can you explain what's going on there?
Yeah, I think that's the question, and I've been looking at this for a very long time. It's affected me personally. I grew up, of course, here in Dallas, and I've seen the cycles and how things work. And when we talk about the Bushes, that's where that embrace was coming from. It was a true embrace by the push, and this is where I thought, okay, well, this is where they're going to reach out, and this is where we're going to start making things happen. And then, I kid you not, 9/11 was an opportunity, I think, for the creation of the other. And whoever that's going to be, whoever we're going to make the bad person or the fearful thing, when we think about people coming over without inspection in the southern border, I know many people associate that, well, they're not just coming from Mexico, they're coming from, other parts of the world who may want to do harm. You put that in someone's mind, it's a very difficult thing to get out of their heads, even though realistically, that's not how they're coming over. That's not how they're doing it. But that is the fear that is kind of prompted. So I think, unfortunately, there were some within the Republican Party, maybe not the politicians themselves, but strategists who said, well, in order to preserve, Texas is kind of leaning a little bit, if we lose Texas, we'll lose the presidency. So there had to be something that created that blowback. We're going to keep it for a number of years. We got to keep people. We can't let young Latinos vote. If we do that, this could be a real problem, especially there in Texas. So how do we fix that? Well, we're going to have to suppress them for a period of time. Problem is that's continued. It's continued through administrations. There hasn't been enough push by even the Democratic Party to embrace, I think, traditional, as you had mentioned, traditional Hispanic values, which are in conformity a lot with. You'd be very surprised. People would be very surprised by the way in which Latinos vote. the way they look at things, what is important to them.
Typically anti-abortion, for instance,
right.
because the church's position
Absolutely.
is in that
my
way.
mother my mother had real issue with voting Democrat because of that very issue,
Sure.
and then all of her other leaning, and
Right.
and many of us
Right.
in the same way. But yeah, being raised Roman Catholic, that was a real
Well,
issue.
you mentioned being raised Roman Catholic, your mother. Tell us about your own faith experience and how has it fed into your passion? I mean, you're a lawyer. You could be doing corporate law. You could be doing all sorts of other kinds of things. Why the work that you're doing, and how does it connect with your own faith?
Yeah, I think more than anything else, it is from my mother, and certainly my upbringing, and the way in which I feel. I've tried to dissect this on a few occasions and try to see what's first or what lies where. If I'm being really honest with you, I think there's a real problem that I have innately with injustice. There's a real problem with people treating other people just unfairly because of who they are.
Yes.
You know, just off the bat. And I believe that comes from a position of my faith and my upbringing, but honestly there's a component in there that I know that is kind of selfish and self-interest. I don't want my children growing up, I don't want my grandchildren growing up in a society where they are treated differently because of who they are and what they represent. So, but I do know that my mother was an incredibly faithful Catholic.
Right.
She sent us to Catholic school. I went to school down the street at St. Thomas.
Right.
And that is always, all of those things stick with me when I'm making decisions about how I'm going to do things, how I'm going to treat people, whether or not I'm going to take a case pro bono, whether or not I'm going to reach out to someone and do something. So it's always been kind of when I dissect it, I'm not sure what came first, but if I think about it, it is probably based on faith, and it is based on, you know, in my personal view, Jesus' teachings. I mean, the invitation to all, the non-judgment of people for who they are. That's always been, I think, a cornerstone, you know, certainly in the back of my mind when I make decisions and do things. There have been a lot of laws that are just totally, in my opinion, immoral. And we know this throughout his history, and we try to justify that in certain ways throughout history.
Right.
And I just fear that you know, is kind of coming back to the fore.
Right.
And we've just got to be strong and fight against those things, because
So Dr. King talked in his letter from the Birmingham jail about immoral laws.
Right.
And how, you know, laws can be written, and if they do not sync up with the moral law, then they should not be obeyed.
Right.
In fact, you have to have a fidelity to the higher law of moral law. And so I know that often Dr. King is, you know, one of the great heroes of not just the African American community, but also, you know, people who are struggling for human rights generally.
Certainly.
Who are some of your Latino or Hispanic heroes?
Yeah.
King is inspiring to everyone, but I'm curious if you would say, okay, you all ought to know this person or that.
Well,
in our history.
Growing up and being a little bit more rebellious, being an attorney is difficult, because when I have certain feelings towards things, then being an attorney and advising and being in that role, I've got to be careful about how I talk about things. But certainly as a youth, I went to college. I went to the University of Texas at Austin. I had the opportunity to delve into those libraries, look at Latino contributions throughout history, and all of the things that kind of, you know, that I was never exposed to. I'm like, my goodness, we did a lot to, you know, contribute. So for me, I was a little bit rebellious. Emiliano Zapata, who was, you know, people may not see as, he was, you know, part of the, you know, the Mexican Revolution, and he was just very strong, and he's the one who kind of gave us the, you know, it's better to live on your feet than die on your knees. That has kind of always been my, you know, kind of a quiet rallying cry for supporting the small guy, representing the David against the Goliath. In addition to that, and someone that is probably, you know, just truly a reflection of the Latino community and experience, is Cesar Chavez. You know, somebody who quietly, humbly fought back back,
Yes.
and did it in such a way that was very similar to Dr. King, to Gandhi, in terms of
Right.
we're not going to create problems, we're not going to hurt people, but we're going to fight quietly back
Right.
with the resources that we have, and we need to do it as a collection. And I think he embodied that. And he
Yes.
was kind of, for us, probably the person that that's our Dr. King in the Latino
Yes,
community.
I can see that, certainly. Well, I resonate a lot, Eric, with what you're saying about, this notion of how injustice is motivating in your work. It is for me as well.
Right.
And I think one of my friends always says about me, why do you always take the position of supporting the underdog? You know, that's just who you are. And I think part of it, for me at least, is that there's kind of a conscious self-awareness of my privilege,
Right.
of the fact that whatever happens politically, I'm going to be okay.
Right.
That's not true for everyone. Policies, elections have consequences that hurt some people more than others, and so being engaged somehow in making sure that your neighbor has opportunity, the same privileges and freedoms, is really important to me, and I know it is to you.
Right.
A lot of people ask me and my partners at Faith Commons, and I'm sure they ask you, what can we do to be more engaged? And I know a march isn't everything, but it's coming up on March the 30th, beginning at Our Lady of Guadalupe Catholic Church, the cathedral downtown. Tell us about the Super Mega March and how people could turn out for that and what it's about.
Right. If people would go to, I believe it's Mega Marcha, M-A-R-C-H-A, 2025. There's a website that's recently been put up that will provide you information about the route and all the things that we're doing. It's basically an outreach to folks, specifically, hopefully, to Congress, to support immigration reform. I think that is one area, at least in my opinion, where I think there might be some movement with this administration. That possibility of providing DACA recipients with some long-term relief, becoming hopefully ultimately citizens in some way. And then again, people who've been here for years and years, raising families, building businesses, doing, because the way the rhetoric currently is, it looks like people just this administration wants to get rid of all immigrants that may not have come over the right way in their words. So it's a situation where we want to assure the possibility that those people who can be saved, we can make that happen. And that's the purpose of the march. We're going to go out there and do it in such ways. There's a part of me, just like I told you, the Zapata and the Cesar Chavez, there have been a number of marches in protest about what's going on. Yeah. Part of me is totally in support of that, what is happening with respect to our government and just the overreach and the unfortunate, maybe sometimes overt, maybe subtle racism involved in some of the things that are going by and doing, real problematic for me. And I want young people especially to recognize that and understand in our country, you have the ability to peacefully protest against those things.
Yes.
This march may be a little bit different in terms of what it is we're trying to do, which is trying to move Congress people to support immigration reform. So we're requesting, not necessarily demanding of anybody that we wear, white, that we raise American flags, that we show that we're really trying to achieve an objective, which is to help as many people as we can that we may be able to do with respect to this current administration.
Yes.
So that is what we're hopeful about with respect to this march, but certainly understanding, because we've had a number of young people who are like, well, why can't we bring our Mexican flag, and why can't we bring our Salvadorian flag? You certainly can if that is what moves you, but the purpose of this march is to move or shift the way in which Congress needs to be nudged in allowing for something like this to happen, because if we can cull anything from what's going on currently in our country, that would be a positive that might be achievable.
Great. Yeah. Well, politics is the art of the possible, isn't it?
That's right.
And so if we're not engaged in one way or another, creating that pressure, offering those voices, it's going to be difficult to move the needle on that. Eric, you move the needle on a lot of things. Sometimes I know it must be discouraging to you to be in the places that you're working, but you encourage a lot of us, and we're grateful for your partnership and for your advocacy. Thank you for all that you do, and thanks for being with us on Good God.
Certainly. Thank you for having me, George.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
You bet.